So pesticides are, unfortunately, quite prevalent in our food, and new studies are always coming out showing how frequently residues are found both on our food products and already in our bodies. Another looked at produce in India and showed that high levels of pesticides are found in pretty much most conventional vegetables. Even my favorite fall fruit, persimmons, which I usually eat a lot of around this time of year, had research done, and scientists found that over 35% of conventional persimmons have high levels of pesticides. And one of the questions that I always get is, does eating organic actually decrease your exposure to pesticides? And the answer is pretty simple, yes. And every year more research comes out about how much eating an organic diet can reduce your exposure to pesticides. Recent research looked at how eating organic affects the presence of pesticide metabolites, and found that people who ate conventional diets had higher levels than consumers who chose organic at least occasionally. So even if you just eat organic sometimes, you have significantly lower levels of pesticides in your bodies than those who don't eat organic at all. And people avoid pesticides for a pretty good reason. They can have some serious impacts on human health. So this year, a large group of leading scientific experts, medical experts, and children's health advocates joined forces in a call to action to reduce exposure to pesticides and other toxic chemicals. And there have been dozens of studies that look at the link between pesticide exposure and health over the last year. I'm just going to focus on a few of them. So this year I saw more studies than ever before linking pesticide exposure with children's health problems. And I had a baby in February, so this has been a really personal issue for me, especially since several of the studies actually look at the prenatal exposure and how it can affect babies for the rest of their lives. So one study found that pre-birth exposure to pesticides and persistent pollutants could be linked to developmental obesity and metabolite disorders. So what the researchers found was that prenatal exposure to pesticides can actually alter how the body breaks down sugars, potentially contributing to obesity much later in life. Another study found that prenatal exposure to pesticides can lead to developmental problems such as tremors in children. Another one looked at childhood leukemia. So there have been a lot of studies about children, and it's not just the physical health of children that can be affected by pesticide exposure. Their mental development can also be impaired. So researchers found that pesticide exposure in childhood can lead to neurodevelopmental impairment, and that children who are exposed to higher levels of pesticides tend to test lower for intelligence and comprehension. Another one followed in kind of the same vein and found that even just living near conventional farms can decrease children's IQ. Another study found that children's potential to learn and develop socially could be negatively impacted by pesticide exposure. So they looked at 287 mothers and children for 6 years and found that exposure to pesticides was linked to cognitive developmental disabilities in children. Another one looked at mental health in children. They found that pesticides were also linked to ADHD symptoms in children. And it's not just children's intellects that can be impaired by exposure to pesticides. There was also research that came out this year looking at cognitive function in elders. And these are quote-unquote elders ages 60 to 85, so not that elder. And they found that high exposure to pesticides resulted in 6.5 times higher risk of low cognition. They also, a different study also showed that exposure to pesticides can cause up to a 350% higher risk of the development of hypertension-induced dementia. So it's really important to think about pesticides when considering childhood health, but children aren't the only ones that need to be protected from pesticide exposure. And a lot of research continues to come out about adult health and exposure to pesticides. So one of the things that can be compromised by pesticide exposure is respiratory health. And this is an area that's seen a lot of research over the last few years. And actually, the last farmer meeting I went to, I was speaking with a woman who farms organically, but used to farm conventionally. And the reason she switched over was because of respiratory ailments from those synthetic pesticides that she used. So there's a lot of research coming out, but there are also a lot of personal stories of farmers who have been impacted by pesticides. Parkinson's is a disease that's perennially seeing research released showing how it's linked with pesticide exposure. And I think at this point there are over 11 different pesticides that have been linked really directly to the development of Parkinson's. There's also been a wave of studies coming out about the exposure to pesticides and increased risk of cancer. One large-scale study looked at over 33,000 people over 10 years and showed that exposure to herbicides, even at very low doses, can increase the risk of developing lung cancer. And at higher doses, it can also lead to melanoma, pancreatic, and colorectal cancer. There's also a study specifically focusing on lung cancer, which looked at the relationship between use of organophosphate pesticides and lung cancer. And there was another even larger study with data from over 25,000 participants that showed that pesticide exposure significantly increases the risk of lung cancer. There was a study examining prostate cancer that found a link between pesticide exposure in men, and there was an even scarier study that came out on women that looked at the long-term effects of DDT exposure on breast cancer and showed that prenatal exposure to DDT can increase the risk of breast cancer up to 54 years later, which was how long the study spanned. So it wasn't that at 55 years you're in the clear, it's that the study was 54 years long and they don't have data after that. And DDT is banned now, but I like to point this out because this study shows that we're still finding new health impacts of this pesticide half a decade later. And it's kind of scary. It was certainly scary to me because I know that my parents were definitely sprayed with DDT. There have also been many studies showing that exposure to pesticides can harm reproductive health. Now, most of those studies in the past have looked at reproductive health in women, but just recently we've started seeing studies come out showing that pesticide exposure, even in extremely small amounts, can also have an impact on men's reproductive health. And this brings me to one of the most shocking research studies to come out in the last few years. I mentioned that we're starting to see research come out about dietary exposure to low levels of pesticide residues. So this is probably the first study that I've seen that has been able to clearly demonstrate a health link to dietary low-level chronic exposures to pesticides through a conventional diet. So the research came out of Harvard University, where the researchers were able to show that dietary exposure to pesticides actually lowered sperm quantity and quality in men. And showing a link between health and this low-level chronic dietary exposure is really quite a feat because there are so many differences between individuals' lifestyles that it's much easier to get results that show no significant differences. So what these results mean that even in the face of so many changing variables, even in the face of people having so many different independent choices in their life, there clearly is a health consequence to being exposed to pesticides through the food you eat. The Organic Center also has a project that talks about this, which I'll go over later. But first, I just wanted to look at non-food items. So unfortunately, pesticides on food aren't the only chemicals that we need to worry about. There are a number of chemicals that are used in the production of conventional non-food items. So things like body care, cotton, furniture. And one study that was released this year by one of the Organic Center science advisors showed that cosmetics can play a big role in toxic chemical exposure. So they found that even a short break from using makeup, shampoos, and lotions that contain certain kinds of synthetic chemicals can reduce levels of hormone-disrupting chemicals in teens. Another area that's seen a lot of research this year is flame retardants. And those chemicals are especially dangerous to babies and young children because their brains and endocrine systems are still developing. And one study has found that prenatal exposure to flame retardants can reduce a baby's body mass. It also showed that flame retardants may be affecting sex-linked hormone signaling. So some pretty big deals in prenatal and baby exposure. Unfortunately, we're never just exposed to one pesticide at a time. So many pesticides get used in combination. So a lot of the food that we eat actually has a cocktail of residues on it. And there hasn't been much research done in the past on health effects of multiple pesticide exposure because it's a very complex issue. But lately, more and more researchers are looking at this because they're finding that pesticides can have a synergistic negative effect on health, where being exposed to pesticide cocktails is more harmful than the additive negative effects of each individual pesticide. And just a few months ago, a study came out summarizing what research has been done, and they found that 90% of fungicide combinations were associated with effects on endocrine regulation and or reproduction, and insecticide cocktails often had a synergistic interaction or greater than additive effect. And another study came out that really illustrated the greater than additive effects that I'm talking about, showing that exposure to very low doses of multiple chemicals at a time can increase cancer-causing mutations. And those chemicals that they looked at, if they looked at them individually, they didn't show any correlation with increased cancer risk. But when they looked at the cocktail effect, the results were pretty alarming. Another study that was kind of groundbreaking in a scary way that came out last year looked at inactive ingredients in pesticides, which are usually termed inert ingredients. And they can actually increase the toxicity of the active ingredients. So the safety of pesticides is only based on the active ingredients, but this study found that inactive ingredients can make the true toxicity of pesticides up to 1,000 times more toxic than their active ingredients. And when they looked at inert ingredients in combination with active ingredients, they found that Roundup, which is usually touted as a very safe pesticide, was an example of a pesticide with high toxicity. And some long-term effects of pesticide exposure can even act across generations. So this is talking about disease inheritance, which the technical term is epigenetic transgenerational inheritance of disease, where you can pass environmentally caused diseases on to your children and grandchildren. So the way it works is that if you're exposed to a chemical, that chemical can have a negative effect on you, and you can actually pass those negative effects on to your children without them ever being exposed to the original chemical. So, for example, there was a study that looked at rats that were exposed to pesticide, and they found that the third generation of rats, so that's the great-grand rat babies, had an increased incidence of multiple environmentally induced diseases. So the rats that were exposed to the environmental toxin, in this case pesticides, passed on that increased risk of disease 3 generations down the line to great-grandchildren that had never been exposed to the toxin before. There are several organic center projects that look at health aspects associated with eating organic. Now, these are all cutting-edge projects that are still happening as we speak. So I'm not going to give you any specific data until they're published, but I just wanted to give you a preview of what to expect from the Organic Center in 2017. So one is a collaboration with Harvard University that looks at how dietary exposure to pesticides affects people's health, and we're working on submitting a publication now, so stay tuned. A project that we launched earlier this year looks at the extent to which hormones, antibiotics, and pesticides that are used in conventional milk production can be detected in retail conventional milk as compared to organic milk. And we just got back some preliminary data on that one, and I can't share that yet because we're waiting for some further analysis, but let's just say I'm really glad that I choose organic milk for my family. And another project that we're working on uses a life cycle analysis to look at the overall impacts of organic food and farming on human health. And specifically, we're looking at 3 factors: nutritional benefits of organic, the lack of pesticide residues, and the health effects on farm workers. And all those projects should be wrapping up in the next year, so stay tuned. The agricultural use of antibiotics has been in the news a lot this year because of the rise in antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So the Center for Disease Control put out a report showing that over 2 million illnesses and 23,000 deaths are caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria every year in the U.S. alone. And in 2014, the World Health Organization declared antibiotic-resistant bacteria a global epidemic. And the problem is that in conventional agriculture, antibiotics aren't just used to treat infection. About 90% of the antibiotics used are given as growth-promoting or prophylactic agents because antibiotic use can increase the rate of weight gain by 3 to 5%. Also, the use of antibiotics in animals is 100 to 1,000 times higher annually than the use in the human population. And the widespread use of antibiotics in agriculture selects for bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. And those bacteria can be passed to humans through contact with livestock, manure, or food produced from livestock, so dairy, meat, eggs, etc. And studies come out every year demonstrating this. And a few months ago, the Organic Center put out a report that reviews all of the primary literature on antibiotic-resistant bacteria over the last decade or so. And it shows that organic can reduce your exposure to antibiotic-resistant bacteria through choosing organic. So organic doesn't use antibiotics in its production, so there's less prevalence of resistance on organic animal products. One of my favorite studies that came out this year, and the reason it's one of my favorite is because it's actually positive as opposed to all these negative studies that I've been mentioning, and it focused on omega-3 fatty acid differences between organic and conventional milk. And there was also one that was done on meat. So the one on milk showed that organic milk has 56% more omega-3 fatty acids than conventional, which is a good thing because you want higher omega-3 and lower omega-6 fatty acids to help maintain cardiovascular health and support your immune system. And the same research team also looked at organic meat and found that it has 47% higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids than its conventional counterparts. So there are also several studies that have come out in the last year showing the environmental benefits of organic farming. And the first one I want to talk about is pollinators, since this has been an issue that's been in the news a lot lately. We need bees for most of our crops, things like apples, almonds, blueberries, cherries, avocados, basically everything that's delicious relies on honeybees and native pollinators. And it's no secret that bee populations have been declining. Scientists recently looked at honeybees in Europe, for example, and found a widespread shortage throughout the continent. And unfortunately, those declines could have major effects on human health. So one study found that bee population declines could lead to an increase in malnutrition because pollinators are so critical for the most nutrient-rich crops. And pesticides are one of the main causes of bee death. Several studies have come out this year pointing out how pesticides have negative impacts on bees. So neonicotinoids, or neonics, as you call them for short, are a class of pesticides that have been really fingered out as having a negative impact on bee populations. So studies over the last 2 years have shown that both seed coats and aerial sprays can harm bees, even at very low levels. And one that came out recently analyzed almost 2 decades worth of data on 62 different species of wild bees and found that sublethal exposure, so even when the bees weren't being killed, neonicotinoid pesticides can lead to population decline. So even without directly killing the bees, the bee populations decline with exposure to neonicotinoids. And those studies that show that direct link between neonicotinoid use and honeybee decline have led the European Food Safety Authority to conclude last year that neonics should be classified as a high risk to bee populations. And neonics were also the focus of a study that had some pretty surprising results, showing that bees can actually become addicted to neonics the same way humans become addicted to nicotine. So they found that neonicotinoids can drive bees to consume more of the pesticide-contaminated food than they normally would, meaning that whole colonies could be exposed to higher levels of pesticide that's out in the field than we previously thought. And neonics aren't the only pesticide group that has negative effects on bees. Even pesticides that are generally viewed as benign to insects, like Roundup, have been shown to have unexpected negative impacts on pollinators. So one recent study showed that low levels of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, impaired bees' cognitive capabilities, making it difficult for them to navigate back to the hive. There's also been a lot of research directly linking organic agriculture with benefits to pollinator health. So one study compared organic and conventional farms and found that there's higher pollinator diversity on organic farms. So the current state of pollinators may be down, but organic could create a bright future for them. Organic agriculture is also better at supporting birds, mammals, amphibians, plants, and other life. So it's not just pollinators that are supported by organic agriculture. And one of the main reasons is that, like humans, pesticides are toxic to native plants and animals. And I'm a huge plant nerd, so I'm always paying attention to studies about native plants. And one interesting one that came out this year talked about something that we don't think about very often, rare native plants that are technically considered weeds. So some weeds in fields aren't harming crops, but they're casualties of target weeds when conventional pesticides get sprayed. So it's no surprise that the study found that in organic fields, rare native plants were able to thrive. But what did surprise me was the scale of it. So rare species were 400% more common in organic fields. Organic farming is also good for water quality. So for example, it decreases nutrient runoff, which has been associated with dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. And dead zones occur when fertilizer runoff that's high in nitrogen and phosphorus enters the water and leads to an overgrowth of algae. And that algal overgrowth eventually dies and decomposes, which depletes oxygen in the water, leaving an area where basically no aquatic organisms can survive because they need that oxygen. So recent studies have shown that organic farming can prevent this because organic systems result in less nitrogen loss than conventional crop farming. And there have been several published papers in the last year that have demonstrated this, which is really cutting edge because isolating nitrate leaching systems by farms is extremely complicated, especially over several years. And one study found that over 3 years, nitrate loss in the conventional cropping systems was twice as high as nitrate loss from the organic cropping system. And even when the researchers scaled their findings by yield, which is a more conservative estimate, since organic farms sometimes have lower crop yields than conventional farms, nitrate leaching was still consistently lower for organic farms. And using organic techniques to preserve water quality is also important for preventing pesticide contamination. So one of the studies that came out recently looked at data from over 2,500 sites in 73 different countries and found that agricultural pesticides are contaminating water from across the globe. And more than half of the test sites tested positive for pesticides exceeded the legally acceptable levels of pesticide contamination. And one of the most surprising results was that highly contaminated waters were present even in countries with the strongest environmental regulations, with newer insecticides accounting for a larger amount of current pesticide contamination. So those are countries like the United States that have some pretty strong environmental regulations, but even with those environmental regulations, there's still pesticide contamination in water. Next, I'll talk about soil. And soil is basically the backbone of our food security. So without soil, none of our crops could grow. And unfortunately, conventional agricultural practices have been degrading our soil. The good news is that organic techniques can build soil health back up. So over the last few years, long-term studies have started being published looking at how organic farming affects soil over a longer time scale. And they show that the longer the land is managed organically, the healthier the soil becomes. There were also studies showing that organic management increases beneficial fungal diversity in soils. Other studies showed that organic farming can improve and increase macrobiotic soil communities, so things like earthworms, beetles, beneficial nematodes, as well as microorganism activity, nutrient availability, and soil structure. And not only does this have a positive impact on the soil's ability to hold nutrients, water, and other important factors to plants, it also can have another benefit. It can suppress pathogens that would otherwise attack plants. And soil plays into the next topic that I'm going to be talking about, which is climate change. And there have been several studies looking at how organic plays a part in mitigating climate change. I mentioned soil health, and increasing soil organic matter content leads to more carbon sequestration in soil. So one study found that practices such as replacing chemical fertilizers with organic manure, using crop manures as forage for cattle, so these practices that are used on organic farms significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase storage of carbon in soils. Organic is also more energy efficient than conventional farming. The process to make synthetic nitrogen is very energy intensive, so just by not using synthetic fertilizer, organic saves a lot of energy. And one of the things that makes organic more energy efficient is the diversity of crops in their system. So this means that multi-structured organic farms actually have better energy efficiency than farms that only grow a single crop over a large scale. There's also less synthetic nitrogen on the field, which leads to no N2O release, or lower levels of nitrous oxide release. And I mentioned that organic reduces nitrogen leaching into soils, but research also shows that organic reduces emissions of nitrogen into the atmosphere. The Organic Center is conducting several projects focused on sustainability. So we released a pollinator health report that demonstrates the benefits of organic on pollinator populations. The paper goes over specific cases of pesticide impacts on pollinator health, but it also talks about the lesser-known benefits of organic farms, such as more diverse habitat for pollinators and increased food sources. We have a project in collaboration with the University of Virginia focused on preserving water quality by looking at nitrogen pollution. And our findings show that conventional agricultural practices create over 50% more new reactive nitrogen than organic. We also just published a calculator that growers and consumers can use to measure their nitrogen footprint based on consumption and production choices. We also have a project looking at the cradle to grave impacts of organic farms on climate change in collaboration with Harvard University. And we have a soil health project in collaboration with the National Soil Project at Northeastern University, comparing sequestered carbon in organic versus conventional farms. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions.
Hi, this is Maggie again. If you do have any questions, please identify yourself first. And well, I have a question, Jessica. You know, I've read that organic crops have higher levels of antibiotics. Why would that be the case?
Sure. So could you say that question again? Sorry.
You know, I've read that organic crops have higher levels of antibiotics. Can you explain that? Why would that be the case?
Oh, you know, I think that the research shows that actually organic doesn't have antibiotics in it, and the reason for that is because antibiotics are banned from use in organic, and that's always been true for livestock, but just recently they implemented a ban on antibiotics even for tree crops. So they used to be sprayed in low levels on apples and pears, but I think 2 or 3 years ago, the National Organic Standards Board sunsetted that allowance. So now there's absolutely no allowed use of antibiotics on organic. And I mentioned that I didn't really want to share any of the findings from our dairy research, but I will share that we looked at antibiotic levels in conventional and organic milk, and in every single organic sample that we looked at, there was 0 levels of antibiotics, and every single conventional sample we looked at had levels, and most of those levels were below the regulatory maximum, so they're still legally allowed to be sold in stores, but antibiotics are present in conventional where they're not in organic.
Any other questions?
I also want to say that if anybody does have questions, if you think of questions after the call, you can feel free to email me, email Maggie, she can connect you with me, but we're constantly looking at all of the science that's being published. I mean, we do literature searches on a daily basis and then write summaries of those. Everything from a one-line description of the results to a more in-depth analysis of the studies. So any topic that you're interested in, if you reach out to us, we can pull together some resources for you with links to the scientific studies. So you don't have to take our word for anything. You can look at the results of these studies to look at what scientists are finding.
I'm seeing a question here from Max Goldberg. Could you please talk a little bit more about the Harvard study about pesticides and lower sperm quality in men, and what ages of men were studied?
Oh, absolutely. So I don't have the ages in front of me, but I will follow up and send you a summary of that study and a link to the study itself so you can really dive into it. I will say that what they were looking at were the different kinds of produce that men were eating, and the produce that had higher levels of pesticide residues were what was associated with more degraded sperm. So it's kind of interesting because they weren't specifically comparing organic versus conventional. They were looking at a gradient of pesticide consumption. So that to me is really interesting because it means that there's this, it's not just an all or nothing. It's as you decrease your exposure to pesticide residues on conventional crops, you will actually see an improvement in health. And in this case, it was sperm quality. So, and that's kind of what we've been seeing from a lot of studies that do look at organic versus conventional, is that even if you choose some organic, it can have an impact on how much pesticide you're exposed to.
Yeah. That is cool.
Anyone else?
We have a Christine Kapperman would like to review the report on nutrition. Jessica, would you like to share that with everybody that was on the call, just in case? Yeah, absolutely. I'll send out those 2 studies in our summaries. So the ones that I spoke about specifically were the increased omega-3 fatty acids in meat and a similar one that was done on dairy. Also, 2 years ago, there was one that looked specifically, I think it may have been 3 years now, that looked specifically at crops. And one of the studies that people always bring up when mentioning nutrition is the Stanford study. That study was done 4 or 5 years ago now. So this is a different study that looks at more data and has a much more robust statistical analysis system. So I'll go ahead and send out that study as well, just in case people haven't seen it or are interested. And it looks at antioxidant levels in organic crops. Great, thank you.
So how can people incorporate these research studies into their everyday lives?
So one thing that we do is we try and get people interested in science or knowledgeable about these scientific facts by meeting them where they are, so by developing things that are interesting to them in their everyday life. So, for example, we make recipes. So we have recipes that people can use to develop these delicious dishes, but the main ingredients in those recipes will have a little blurb about the scientific results from some of these studies. So that's just one way that we try and take the science and make it real for people. And I think that that's one of the things that's really important to do. It's also really important to tell stories of people. So I'm out there talking science all day, but when I'm at these conferences, when I'm at farmers conferences, when I'm at conferences with a lot of parents, I get to talk to people who have real life stories about how these different scientific studies that I read about actually impact their lives. So that's another thing, that if people are looking for people who've had experiences with any of these issues, I think it's good to have the scientific basis in addition to the anecdotal evidence.
Okay, well, this has been great, and if we don't have any more questions, I'll let you all know that we will be sending out some resources you can use, including Jessica's presentation, along with some other holiday news goodies. And the webinar has been recorded, and we'll be uploading it on the TOC website. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Jessica, for a really informative talk. It's very useful news. So thanks everyone, and happy holidays.
Thanks everyone. Bye.